Just a little short of 10:24, our Mellow Joy coffee time. My pleasure on these Thursday mornings to welcome in, usher in, if you will, another edition of Positively Iberia as we welcome back to the show Marti Harrell. Marti, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jeff, and I'm so glad you brought us some fall back.
Yeah, that was me.
I knew you did, you know.
Actually, it's too cold for me, 70 degrees.
Did you wear your long pants today?
Oh, of course not.
I didn't think so.
December,
I know it's
maybe.
Yeah, it's got to be freezing, I think, for that, right?
Weddings, funerals, and really, I've got to look so stupid to be wearing shorts to make me put pants on. That's kind of the defining line.
Oh, is that it? I always say, you know, if you can leave the house dressed however you want, just remember that in case your car breaks down, if you want to be seen like that on the side of the road, right? That's the deal. Well, you know, last Friday, Jude Walker, who's an on-air personality at 99.9 KDDY, one of those other radio stations, posted his, quote, 10 most famous people from Iberia Parish. It's part of their series of the, quote, most famous people from each of the Acadiana parish. And he was quick to point out that it's just an arbitrary list made by one radio disc jockey, just 10 people that they thought deserved this, quote, honor, end quote. And of course, among those, athletes, restaurateur, voice actor, talent agent, thoroughbred jockey, Tabasco mogul, Governor Kathleen Blanco, best-selling author James Lee Burke, you'll find the subject of today's discussion, famed Blue Dog artist George Rodrigue. And after nearly 2 years of scheduling changes due to life in the time of COVID and other challenges, we are so happy to have Wendy Rodrigue Manus with us today, zooming in live from the Rodrigue Room at her home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, many know Wendy as George's widow and the benefactor of the Rodrigue exhibit at our Bayou Teche Museum, but here's a bit about Wendy Ann Wolf. Her parents are originally from New Orleans, but she was raised in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, where her dad was stationed at Hurlburt Field Air Force Base and still lives. Her mother, an incredible artist herself, sparked Wendy's passion for the arts, and she passed away in 2004. Now, Wendy graduated from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, with degrees in, what else? Art history and English, and studied art history during an 8-month intensive at the American University in Vienna. Now, she attended graduate school at Tulane, but dropped out 2 months before graduating in order to take a job with the Rodrigue Gallery of New Orleans. 6 months later, fall of 1991, she moved to Carmel, California, and managed Gallery Blue Dog Limited for 6 years. During that time, she also traveled to George Rodrigue's galleries in Munich, Germany, and Tokyo, Japan. Of course, there's lots more, but the rest, as it is said, is history, for real. Well, welcome to Positively Iberia, Wendy.
Thank you, Marti. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm glad we finally were able to make this happen.
Yeah, broken kneecap and all, right?
Yes. Yes.
That was another delay. It wasn't all life at the time of COVID. My. You know, Wendy and I agreed to let George's own words inspire the flow of today's discussion. So here goes. When he was asked about his famous blue dog, he replied, quote, "I'm expressing the feelings of mankind today through the blue dog. The dog is always having problems of the heart, of growing up, the problems of life. The dog looks at us and asks, why am I here? What am I doing? Where am I going? Those are the same questions we ask ourselves. People look at the paintings and the paintings speak back to them." So let's start with growing up, shall we? Wendy, take that away. You know that better than any of us.
Well, I loved quoting George right here again, because no matter where we went in the world. We could be walking on the Champs-Elysees, and I would say, "Oh, George, isn't this fabulous, the Champs-Elysees?" And he'd say, "Yes, but it's not New Iberia."
How awesome is that?
He loved New Iberia best. And what I remember too is when we were dating, he brought me to New Iberia a few times, but for drives. So we would go driving down Main Street, and we'd drive by the family home where he grew up, which is still there, of course, on St. Peter. And he would tell me stories and things. But what I loved the most, and when I really got to know New Iberia through his eyes, was in the first few years that we were married, when we lived in Lafayette for 4 years. And on Sundays, he would say, "What do you want to do this afternoon?" Because we all know Sundays are special and we like to do family things. And we got really attached to driving to New Iberia to visit with his Aunt Irene. Irene Courage, maybe you knew her, Marty. She was so fabulous. Her husband was George's uncle Emile, who had the junkyard there in New Iberia. And George, of course, was an only child, so he was very close to his many cousins. His mother, Marie Courage, was one of 13, and his daddy was one of 17.
Wow.
So the cousins, you can imagine, they're everywhere. So I'm constantly meeting them. People are always coming up and saying, "I'm George's cousin. I'm George's cousin." I'm like, "I'm sure that you are," because they're so many.
Wouldn't doubt it a bit, huh? And isn't Catherine Huckabee from Victor's one of those cousins too?
Yes, she is. And George very much considered her to be a sister. Same with her sister. Her sisters, Cheryl and Susan. I mean, they were just really close. And of course, John Edward, their brother as well. And they were George's brothers and sisters in his mind. And so Aunt Irene, their mother, was just one of his favorites. And she had this very endearing, some of your listeners may remember this very endearing stutter. So she could tell a story. It could be the most tragic, sad story on the planet. And George and I were both stifling our laughs because she was just so cute in her innocence and her way that she expressed herself. So that was one of our favorite things, and what we would do to hear New Iberia stories and for George to reconnect with home. And the other thing that he did so often is he would take his mama riding. His mother came to live with us when we got married. She lived to be 103.
Wow.
And she was quite something. I'm sure some of your listeners knew her. Maybe you met her also. She was quite a pistol. And he would take her riding, and I would get to be in the back seat and eavesdrop on those old New Iberia stories. And one of my favorites was, you can still see it today on St. Peter Street, the little wishing well in the backyard. George's daddy built that for her as a gift on their wedding anniversary, brick by brick. He was a bricklayer. He built that house brick by brick too.
Wow.
George. Yeah.
Are there plans for I know the home is in beautiful shape and beautifully maintained and restored. Are there any plans for it to become a public building for us?
I absolutely hope that will happen. And I have spoken with Marcia Patu and Kathy Indest and Paul Scheck Snyder and numerous people in New Iberia there about that, and that is what I would like to see happen. So we have talked about that. There's all these phases, of course, because of course we've got the park and the studio at the Bayou Teche Museum and all of this. But my hope is that will happen. I would like to see that happen. Yes.
And any other remembrances that George shared with you but it's not New Iberia?
Well, for one thing, I don't know that we ever went to a movie that he didn't talk about the Evangeline Theatre, and especially seeing the creature from the Black Lagoon there. That was a huge thing for him. He painted the creature from the time he was in high school and all the way up until the last year of his life. He was doing creature paintings. In fact, I'm going to bring one with me on the tour this time, one of those late ones. And then, his fondest memories were sitting on the edge of the Bayou Teche and painting what he saw there and what he imagined in his mind happened as the Cajuns came into South Louisiana, as his ancestors did. George was descended from 4 Rodrigue brothers that walked and eventually got on their pirogues to get into South Louisiana. And that history was really important to him, as to all the Cajun people, I believe, from what I've met and learned. And so that experience of painting on the Bayou Teche and sitting there quietly while many times his friends were doing other things, but that's where he wanted to go, was into that world. And I will tell one other brief story, because the piece is at the Bayou Teche Museum. George used to paint, particularly his tighter Cajun paintings. You can see one of them on the wall right here behind me. This is Miss 4th July, Karen Crow. For your listeners, you'll be able to go back in. Marti is recording this with videos, so you'll be able to see it. This was from 1971, from the first year that he was painting people. And he used to talk about how years ago, as a young boy, he was down at the Bayou Teche painting, and he looked down in the mud, and there was something shiny in the mud. And he reached down with both hands and grabbed it, and it was the hilt of a sword.
Oh my.
Pulled out this sword like Excalibur, or Arthur from Excalibur. And he said it was a Knights of Columbus sword. And from then on, to paint those type paintings that I was just showing you there, he used that as a maul stick. So he would take it and he would lay it across the painting, and then put his hand across it to keep it steady, to paint those very tight images. And that maul stick, that sword that he used, is at the Bayou Teche Museum in that little studio recreation.
Wow, that's interesting. I did read in one of your blog posts about George was a polio survivor, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And he found his love for painting by paint by number. Did I get that right?
That is part of the story. Absolutely. When he had polio in the 3rd grade, and was bedridden for 6 months. And of course, didn't know if he would ever walk again. His mother, of course, was the one who was really scared, didn't know. And she also was very frustrated because George was so bored. And I love telling this in schools to the kids, because they can't comprehend, that he didn't have a device. And They can't comprehend that they didn't even own a television. And so they can't wrap their minds around that. And of course, very contagious. So that resonates particularly now, of course, with the pandemic and those sorts of things. His mom went down to the little 5 and Dime on Main Street there in New Iberia, and went in and was telling her friend who ran the place how bored George was. And she said, well, we just got in these paint by number kits. They had just been invented. Isn't that funny to think of paint by number having, it had to have been invented? Well, it had just been invented. And she bought some of those literally out of desperation. George had never painted before. 3rd grade. And the great George Rodrigue, who did all of these incredible paintings, had never painted before. And so he used those paints, but he didn't like the image. It was the Last Supper. little third grade George, go figure, had no interest in painting the Last Supper. So he flipped it over and he painted the things that he missed while he was lying there in bed. He painted his dogs, he painted his friends, painted crawfish and alligators and all these sorts of things. And that's how he first started painting. It was quite something. And I like to tell this in schools too, and to adult students too, because aren't we all still kids inside?
Oh, absolutely.
That is the very first painting that George Rodrigue, one of America's greatest modernist painters, ever saw in his life, was his own.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because there were no museums or galleries or anything like that back in those days. And
no art teachers in the schools. No.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? Well, speaking of problems, let's talk a little bit. He talked about the Blue Dogs addressing problems of life. Let's talk a little about, we know a lot about his successes. Anything you'd care to share about failures?
Oh, well, I'll tell you one he liked to tell, a story he liked to tell a lot. And that was George's very first museum show was at the old state capitol in Baton Rouge. And he had a cousin who was managing the space there.
One of the 922 cousins, right?
Yes. So George had not started painting his people paintings yet. He was doing all dark oak trees, which you can see some of these earliest ones. In fact, above that Miss 4th July Karen Crow, there's some really early dark oak trees. You all in New Iberia are the most familiar with those pieces, of course.
Absolutely.
Where that grew out of in his mind. Anyway, so he had done 70 of these oak tree paintings. He had 70 of them, all sizes from little bitty. In fact, I've got a few of those in the other room. I should have grabbed a couple that are like literally 2 by 3 inches,
Right,
to 7 feet across, the whole thing. And they were framed, ready to go. He would buy his frames at secondhand places, flea markets and garage stores and garage sales and things, and then toss out other people's paintings and paint his paintings to fit them. Anyway, he tells this cousin, here you are, my cousin, can't I have a show? And the cousin says, no, I've got it. Everything's booked and all this. And I can't, and it's hard to get taken seriously as a young artist. Well, all of a sudden, the cousin calls him one day in a panic because an art show he had scheduled backed out on him last minute. And he only had 2 weeks to fill the space. George said, I'll be there. He puts in this whole magnificent show, incredible. And on that Sunday, he knew the reporter from the Advocate, the Lafayette paper.
Advertiser, daily advertiser.
Thank you. Was going to be going to see the show. Or actually, no, it might have been the Advocate. That's right, because it was in Baton Rouge.
In Baton Rouge,
Yes.
yeah.
So she was going to see the show to review it for the Sunday paper. And George is checking the paper every day. And finally, here it comes. And he opens it up, and he would always tell it like this. He opened his mouth real wide because it was a half page. His very first press, very first show, very first review. And they had paintings, pictures in there and everything. And then he reads the headline: Artist makes Louisiana dreary, monotonous place. And it got worse from there.
Oops.
Yes, it got worse from there. George used to always say that too. I mean, she bashed him. And then the very last line, almost as if she knew she might be making a mistake, she said, of course, he might turn out to be something after all one day.
That is so interesting. So interesting.
George used to always say that it was really good for him to have that criticism right out of the gate because it taught him not to take himself so seriously. It also taught him to never listen to what other people said about his work, whether it was bad or good. Either way, you also always listen to what happens inside of you and how you feel about it.
Yep. What other people think of us is none of our business, right?
There you go.
Well, that is very interesting. And of course, one of the other problems of life is his loss. That must have been, I see pictures of y'all going through those last public appearances and that sort of thing, where he wasn't the robust man that most of us remember George. That must have been just totally devastating for you. And it certainly was for all of us who loved George and his work. But there was one thing, I think, and again, doing a little legwork, getting ready, I found one thing very positive that came out of that process. And you know what I'm talking about. So you want to take that away?
Sure. Yeah, you're talking about my yoga practice.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. In many ways, it saved me. It's one of the things that saved me for sure. I actually had been practicing for years. I first started yoga the year that George and I were married, which was 97, mainly because I mentioned his mother earlier coming to live with us. And she was interesting, and I was a young bride, and I was trying to keep peace in the house, and it was difficult. I had a hard time with it. So my yoga was my go-to to relax, and it helped tremendously and stayed with me all these years up till today. And when George was sick in the hospital, I would practice next to his bed because he needed me. But I knew that I needed to be strong in many ways. But one of those ways was physically strong because of lifting him and bathing him and the wheelchairs and all those sorts of things. And but I also needed this kind of strength and this kind of strength.
Oh, yes. From the heart. Yes, absolutely.
That's perhaps the most important kind of strength. And so after he died, I didn't feel I had anything to live for. I mean, George was my whole world, and truly. And so I would just not get out of bed, but I would look at my mat across the room and I would stare at it, sometimes for hours. And do you know, Marty, every day, sometimes it wouldn't be till 5 p.m, I would get out of that bed, crawl to that mat, and start my practice. And every time I finished, and every time afterwards, I felt a little better. So I crawled my way back.
That's it. That's it. And I understand when you broke your knee, it didn't stop your yoga practice. You from your dolly, right?
That's right, from my dolly. Can't stop it.
For those who don't know, you didn't break your knee skiing, which everybody thought you should tell that story, but you tripped over something and broke your kneecap. Is that it?
I wasn't even in high heels. And the people who know me, I know, would be shocked to hear that. Everybody always thought that was coming because I love my heels so much. No, I just tripped setting the table for dinner. Everything went flying, including me.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm glad you're on the mend and off the dolly and that kind of and you're here today, and that's a great thing. Okay, now let's talk about the Life and Legacy Foundation, because that answers the dog's why am I here, what am I doing, and where am I going? So tell us about Life and Legacy Foundation.
Yeah, well, I was mentioning there were a couple of things that saved me in those couple of years after George died. I had a really hard time finding any purpose for me. And I didn't really care to find one. So I wasn't even on the search for one. And there were, in addition to my yoga practice, there were a couple of other things that saved me. One was the people in my life, of course. And so I have to say that because there's no question. My sister, for example, would never give up on me. And I think it was because of her that I didn't entirely give up on myself, because I knew it would have hurt her so badly. And the other, which really was the most important, was my current husband, Douglas Magnus, who I tell people very openly, he saved my life. That is the truth. He saved my life. And we'll get more into that, I think, later. You were going to ask me. He was quite wonderful. And
well, we can talk about that, because one of the things, let's go ahead, and since you mentioned it, let's go ahead and talk about that. One of the things that you shared with me is that people are often struck by his unwavering support for this Life and Legacy programming. But Douglas is quoted as saying, quote, "There are three of us in this marriage because I love George too."
Yes, he's remarkable. I couldn't do the tour without him. He gives me, just invaluable feedback all of the time. The tour keeps growing and expanding in all different kinds of ways because he has that vision. And we all know a fresh eye is always great, but in this case, a fresh artistic eye. Douglas is a very accomplished artist, photographer, videographer, painter, stone carver, and he is best known as a silversmith. In fact, he is one of the premier silversmiths here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we live.
And that's saying something in New Mexico.
It really is. He's quite tremendous. And George was a huge fan of his. And that's how they first met, started off. But they met through a mutual friend. For those of you who have been here to Santa Fe, I hope you know the great Pink Adobe restaurant. The owner there, Rosalie Murphy, was from New Orleans. And she and George became very good friends. And she and Douglas were very close friends. She introduced the two of them. And over time, this was in the mid-'80s, before I even knew George, they became very close. And they collaborated together on some wonderful jewelry pieces and eventually some really great, unique jewelry pieces for me. George would design things and then they'd work together on designing, and then Douglas would finish them off with his own flair. So we've all always kind of been intertwined. But the other thing I would follow up just quickly on that, Marty, is that just after Douglas and I got married, we were married in the summer, July of 2017. And just after we got married, I had the opportunity to speak to a kind of a who's who of New Orleans type audience for some things. And the last thing I said after the end of my speech was, I said, and it takes a strong man to support his wife on the road while she speaks of her love for someone else.
Wow.
I want you all to meet my husband, Douglas Magnus. And they gave him a standing ovation. And he got mobbed. Everybody, especially the men, wanted to meet him because I heard it over and over again. I couldn't do it. But Douglas is that kind of man. And it's true. He loves George too. And so that's why he's so supportive of this, which brings me to your other question, which was Life and Legacy. And that is the third thing that pulled me out. And it was literally sort of like you with those questions with the George quote that came to you in a vision or in the night.
The muses delivered that.
The muses, yes. It was a similar sort of thing. We've all suffered, everybody. And we all know what it's like to not sleep at night over that suffering. And I spent a lot of time doing that in the months after George passed away. And one night, out of nowhere, came to me that he needs me, that George needs me, like more than ever, more than he ever did. Because all those memories, all those experiences, I can't tell you how many journals. I have a huge box full of my journals. I wrote down everything George said. Today, with Douglas being the artist he is and the technology we have, I'm constantly videoing him, much like he is with me. So every time he starts talking about history of some of his work, I'm going to capture that, have it. But with George, that was back in the day of no phone and then the flip phone. So there wasn't the video camera right at my fingertips. So I wrote everything down, which in many ways was more personal and it was great. He knew it all the time. I was constantly writing in my journals, and he would grab the journal to illustrate a point to me, and he would draw in there or write something else himself. So the journals that's an exhibit in and of themselves. But it occurred to me that what I have is vital for the memory, the legacy, the long-term legacy of George Rodrigue. I've got to share it. I've got to get it out. And also, here we are in our Rodrigue Room, which my husband Douglas very wonderfully, beautifully gave me this room to dedicate to George. So it's got pieces in here. The earliest pieces are from the late 50s all the way up to the year he died, 2013. There's sculpture in here. There's drawings, there's paintings, all of it. I come in here to spend time with George. There is only one chair in here. It was George's. We fought over this chair because I hated it so much. That's why I wanted it in here, because it was his chair. So I sit in here.
And for our listeners, it's got like antlers and cowhide, and I could see where that might have been a bone of contention.
Yeah. So it's in the Rodrigue Room. That's where it belongs. And now I love sitting in it. I love remembering that whole scene of when we got it. And this is where I visit him. It's through his paintings. So I thought, well, if I can do that through his paintings, why can't I do that for others through his paintings? And that's where Life and Legacy evolved. I don't do PowerPoint. I bring original paintings into schools or other lectures. Obviously, museums are a no-brainer, but also any kind of community organizations. I've done many. And in our very digital world, everything being like we are right now, to have this tactile experience is just very rare. And what I find is for the students of all ages, the paintings elicit for them an emotional response, and they get to know George through the artworks, not just through the histories that I impart to them, but through the new history that they grant to the original works with their own interpretations, which are just as valid. And, those are expressed through their own personal stories. And that's a real gift to me also in this journey, because I hear about how others are developing in their own lives on their own artistic journeys, whether through painting or jewelry making or storytelling, or how they get dressed in the morning, or, how they walk into a garden. So life is art.
So you were here in 2019, and you're coming back in mid to late November. Yes. But there's something very special about this visit that in November, right?
Well, it's always special going to New Iberia.
But even more special.
Yes, because, it's ironic how things happen in life. Isn't it amazing? I would have already been in New Iberia. As you know, we had already talked about that, but I broke my kneecap. And so the whole tour had to be shifted. Everything got shifted. Things got shuffled around. Some things are now in February, all this kind of stuff. As a result of this shift, Catholic High, George's alma mater, right there in New Iberia, is my 100th school on the tour. Awesome. I can't believe it. And that's with a year and a half of pandemic in the middle of it, and complete shutdown of all the things that were normalized in all of this. So I'm just thrilled to death. It was meant to be. It's almost like George was saying, Wendy, if you can't figure out New Iberia should be your 100th school, I'm going to break your kneecap until you get it right. So, anyway, I got it. So,
yeah, message received. Thank you very much. Right. I call that a God wink, when those kinds of things happen like that. So, and you teased it with me, and I'm not going to beg you to tell us anything, but you also said you're going to be making an exciting public announcement while you're here. So stay tuned, right?
Yeah, I have a presentation to make publicly there this is something I've been wanting to make happen inside my head for the last several years, and I'm able to do it now. And I'm very, very excited. It's hard to keep it in, but yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's, as I said, just wanted to let everybody know, stay tuned. There is more there. Wait, there's more. Okay. And one other thing that I wanted to just real quickly talk about is how do you think the blue dog speaks to people? What is your take on that? Her, and it's a her, by the way, Tiffany, right? Or at least it was based on Tiffany, a little female dog. But what do you think those bright yellow eyes are trying to tell us?
Oh, yeah. Well, they can tell you whatever you're willing to receive. That's for sure. It never answers the questions, of course, all those questions you posed in the beginning, everything from where did I come from to what does this all mean? And does it matter? The dog is looking at us with those questions, asking for answers, but we're looking back with the same ones. And I'm reminded of something with my yoga practice, since you asked about that ties in with this. Of course, that was always such a big part of my life, and George was very aware of it, as Douglas is, and very supportive. And I asked George at one point, George, would you be willing to consider painting me some sort of a Buddha type image? Not something to worship, I don't think of it in that way, but something to inspire personal inquiry, for example. Mm-hmm. An awareness, to remind me constantly to seek awareness and to develop that. And he pointed and he said, I already did.
Cool.
To the blue dog, yes. And so one of the things I do in schools also that reminds me of your question is I try to bring at least one large piece when I go, and a large piece on metal that's pretty well protected. So the painting is, it's highly sealed and all of that, so the kids can touch it. And I love it because it's just kid height. Like they walk right up to it and they're eye to eye with the blue dog. And I'll say, is blue dog speaking to you? What is he saying? And they have a conversation and they share it with us. And it is everything from, am I going to go to heaven, to, does my mom understand that I want pizza tonight? To everything you can think of. And it's a lot of fun, but it also is very contemplative, and it gets the kids thinking, and they get excited about creating in their own way. And I hope that it helps inspire their imaginations. That's really what this whole tour is about, is, it's rooted in George Rodrigue, the whole Life and Legacy Foundation, but it really can be about any artist, including you and the members of the New Iberia community and all people everywhere. It's life and legacy.
That's awesome. Well, we mentioned this, at the Bayou Teche Museum, you can get a glimpse of George's Carmel by the Sea, California home studio, because you said that's where he did all of his painting during the later days of his life, as he left it when he lost his battle to cancer. And though the scheduled expansion of the Rodrigue exhibit at the Bayou Teche Museum is on hold due to building construction, as we saw last weekend, the George Rodrigue Park next door to the museum on Main Street is already a popular gathering place. Crowds gathered there to take in the Beneath the Balconies Three Tenors performance at the Daily Iberian building across the street. And Paul Shake Snyder tells me that At this point, the current work includes the prep and finish of the back parking lot. We're also waiting to install the George Rodrigue informational kiosk, along with the trilingual plaque that was salvaged from the park site when the Masonic building was destroyed by fire. And of course, all of those wonderful donor bronze plaques that are going to go into the, gazebo, I guess is kind of the word for it. I'm not real sure. So that is all still to come. Jeff, how are we doing on time? I know we have do we have the mayor today?
Yes, standing by.
Okay. Then I will skip our Halloween announcements and remind everybody that later today we'll share, and in case you missed it, post with the video peek behind the curtain of today's segment via Zoom, along with links to things that we mentioned today. If you missed a past segment, they're all archived on the Facebook page video tab. And if audio is your preference, just surf over to KANE1240.com website and replay on demand. And of course, special thanks to our wonderful guest today, Wendy Rodrigue Magnus. I don't know why. Sorry, Doug. The founder and Legacy Foundation, Life and Legacy Foundation. Wendy, real quick, dates you're going to be here and where you're going to go?
I will be there November 16th through 20th, and I'll be 2 days at Catholic High, 1 day at North Lewis. And there's also some sort of event that's going to happen with the park and museum they're working on now. So we'll be posting that on Facebook and also on my website soon. That's legacyarttour.org.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Positively Iberia is produced by your Greater Iberia Chamber of Commerce in cooperation with Teche Matters here on KANE 107.5 FM and AM 1240, supported by the Daily Iberian and Legacy Underwriter. There's a whole lot of bank inside these walls, the First National Bank of Jeanerette. Now, have a happy and safe Halloween, but let's not forget that in Hispanic culture, Halloween is always followed by Dia de los Muertos, which at its heart is a day to commemorate and celebrate the lives of those who are deceased. In fact, they're still treated like members of the family. And in closing, Jack Lemmon is credited with saying, quote, "Death ends a life, not a relationship," end quote. I believe we've seen a prime example of just that today. So we'll see you next Thursday. And remember, it's only getting better.